I hope that this will be a very fruitful workshop. And
thank you very much, Asta. Let's get myself settled in. So I guess I'm going to do this seated. Normally, I like to stand when I'm giving a talk, but on this occasion, I will remain seated. Thank you all for being here, those of you who are online, as well as somewhat smaller number of people physically present in this room, right? And what I want to do is to talk a little bit about how I think meetings should be conducted in a professional setting, right? And I will explain a little bit about what I mean by that as well. And one of the reasons that I would like to do this, and why I was very happy to accept Rasika's suggestion, is that, like him, I have noticed that sometimes meetings are conducted in a somewhat haphazard manner, right? And among us professionals, particularly academics, I think we need to do better than that. So I hope all of you can hear me. I hope all of you can see the slides that are being projected, right? And please let us know in some manner if either I'm not audible or the slides are not visible. Okay, so in my first slide, I am trying to explain what we mean by a meeting. Right? So if you look up a dictionary, it will tell you that a meeting is an assembly of people for a particular purpose, and especially for a formal discussion. Right? It's not a group of people getting together in a bar and having a beer, but usually meeting around a table or in an auditorium or someplace like that, and conducting a specific kind of business. Now, these meetings, depending on the organization, may be a periodic one, a meeting that happens once a year, like an annual general meeting, once a month, like a Senate meeting in a university, or it may be something that happens as and when necessary. Now, such meetings are formal. They are organized in some manner. So somebody is in charge, and we refer to that individual by different names: chairman, president, moderator, and so forth. But that person is controlling the discussion. We say that he is presiding over the meeting, or he, and when I say he, I'm not trying to exclude the ladies. So he or she is the chairman or the chairperson. Okay. Usually the meeting has a list of items that are intended to be discussed and around which decisions are taken, and this is known as the agenda, and that's part of the meeting. And then another important aspect of the meeting is keeping a record of what happened. And a record of the proceedings of a meeting is commonly referred to as the minutes of the meeting, and somebody is responsible for keeping that. So to move on, I use the word professional, right? So let me be fairly clear on what I mean by that. Right now, a professional is a person who is trained and qualified to work in a profession and is paid for doing so, usually paid for doing so. That person is supposed to be skilled and competent in that particular activity. Okay? But there's more to a professional than just the training in a particular activity. There are certain things, particularly in what we call the learned professions, there are certain other attributes that a professional should have. Remember, anyone can be a professional. Your carpenter is a professional, right? A soldier is a professional. A company CEO can be a professional. A prostitute can be a professional, right? So there are all sorts of professionals. I'm talking about people like us, okay? People who have been trained in an intellectual or highly skilled activity and are being paid for doing that activity. Now, such a person must inspire confidence in others, The others may be the person's peers, the person's employers, the person's clients, the person's juniors, right? But you must inspire confidence and you must show that you are confident. So that confidence is part of it, and you convey that in your appearance and in your manner. Now, there are some other attributes that a good professional has that is part of this process of inspiring confidence in others. You need to develop a reputation for being loyal, for having integrity, for showing dedication to your job. And in order to do all this, you should also possess what we call transferable skills, an area of training that is often neglected in our universities. This includes communication skills, management skills, and what are now known as socio-emotional skills. Now, being able to take part in a meeting and contribute to that meeting in a professional way is one of these very important skills. And that is one of the reasons why we are having this discussion. So why do we have meetings? What's the purpose of it? So the ultimate purpose of having a meeting is to take decisions. And these decisions can include administrative decisions, routine decisions that the SLAAS Council, for example, takes all the time. The decisions regarding certain actions or activities that the organization intends to conduct. Elections are an important part of it. The preparation or adoption of reports, recommendations to be made to a superior body, that's also a decision at some point. Adoption of formal resolutions, these are all decisions. Okay. Now, depending on the kind of meeting, the entire group may not participate in the decision-making process, right? There are many hierarchical institutions like government ministries, the military, the corporate sector, where the group's role may just be advisory. The person who is authorized to take decisions, maybe the person chairing the meeting, right? Maybe the person in charge who has just called a group of people to ask them their opinion before he takes the decision. That's not the kind of meeting that I'm going to be talking about today. Right? The kind of meeting I want to talk about is a meeting that is more democratic in nature, where everybody actively contributes to the decision, and the decision is not just taken by one person with some others voicing opinions. Right? So this is the kind of meeting that we tend to have in many academic settings and in many professional settings. And this is the kind of meeting that I really want to focus on. So let's go through the aspects of a meeting, and this is something known, I think, to most of you, so I don't need to spend time on it. There's usually some preliminary work involved in getting ready for the meeting, preparing documents that need to be circulated. For example, you send down the notice of the meeting, where you say the meeting will occur at such and such a time, at such and such a place, and you circulate an agenda. Very often, there are many other documents that need to be circulated so that people can get ready for the meeting. This will include the minutes of a previous meeting, if there was one, as well as other documents that are circulated for information, for discussion, or for approval. And very often, discussion will lead to approval. So I'm not separating these into several categories. Then we have the issue of a quorum. It's another important aspect of the meeting. For the meeting to have some validity, a certain minimum number of members have to be present. We call this the quorum. The quorum can be a specific number, like 20, or it can be some fraction of those who are entitled to attend. For example, you can say 1/3 of the people must be present for there to be a quorum. And the quorum is important because, first of all, you can't start the meeting till you have a quorum. And in some situations, the meeting may end when you stop having a quorum. In other words, when people get up and start to go away. As far as the actual conduct of the meeting is concerned, there are two very important people. One is the chairman or chairperson, right? And I don't intend to be gender specific when I use either of those words. So please excuse me, sometimes I will say chairman when I really mean to say chairperson. Secondly, there will be someone in charge of keeping the records, minutes, if you like, some kind of a record keeper. Normally, this is a secretary, so there may be a person assigned to that job, and in some situations, that person might be the rapporteur. Then after the meeting, there may be some follow-up activities that various people have been assigned to follow up and do. I want to take a moment, a small aside, to explain the meaning of this word rapporteur. And by the way, note the pronunciation is pronounced rapporteur and not rapporteur. Now, a rapporteur, if you look up the definition, is a person appointed by an organization to report on the proceedings of its meetings. Reporting does not mean keeping minutes. So a rapporteur is not normally responsible for the minutes, and many organizations don't have rapporteurs. It so happens that the Sri Lanka Association for the Advancement of Science has the office called rapporteur in every section. In each of our 8 sections, we have a rapporteur. It is my sad experience that the rapporteur very often doesn't know what to do. Right? So they end up doing nothing, just being another committee member. But their function is actually clearly spelled out in Rule 6.5. It says that the rapporteur shall be responsible for keeping records of sectional activities, not meetings, and for collection of material of public interest coming within the purview of his section's activities. It really, I suppose, should read his or her, but this rule was written a long time ago. For release to the news media through the general secretaries and to the editor for use in the association's publications. Okay, so actually their main function is to keep the editor informed of what the section is doing so that that information can be published in the newsletter. That's the rapporteur's job. It is not the sectional president's job. It's not the secretary's job either. Okay, so let's prepare for the meeting. You put all the necessary documents together, the notice of the meeting, the minutes of previous meeting, and so on, and you distribute these to the parties who are expected to be present. The chairperson and the key office bearers who will be responsible for implementing decisions should be familiar with the agenda. They must have a very good idea of what's going on, right? They should expect the decisions that are going to be taken. They must anticipate them, right? And they must be familiar with the documents that they have circulated and the issues that are coming up for discussion. And you shouldn't show up without having a clue what's going on and expect somebody to take the lead, right? The office bearers, the key office bearers, answerable, of course, to the president, have to take the lead. Make sure that the venue is available. Sometimes we've had problems where at the last minute the venue was not available. And you want to make sure that there'll be a quorum. So it's good to send out reminders, right? If the real problem, if you show up for the meeting and there is the quorum and you reschedule it. And then, of course, if refreshments are to be served, you take the appropriate arrangements. The agenda for the meeting is an important part of this. Some ad hoc meetings may only have one agenda item. And a small group of people are appointed to discuss one issue. They show up, they discuss the issue, and that's it. But a more formal meeting, like a SLAAS council, will have several items in the agenda that include some routine items. You always have them. So the preliminaries and the announcements, the minutes of the previous meeting, matters arising out of those minutes, and then a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay, some of which is repetitious. It happens that that agenda item is there in every meeting. Some of it may be for that meeting only. And very often, the agenda will conclude with an item called any other business. So anybody who has something to raise that is not covered in the agenda has an opportunity to raise the issue, and some of these issues will become permanent agenda items later. It's a good idea to number these items in the order in which they are going to be taken up, but the order can be changed by the chair if necessary. Right? So it is very important that if a particular item is going to be discussed in detail, right, a very important or maybe a controversial item which everybody wants to be aware of and contribute to the discussion, it's good to take that up early, even if it's not part of the normal agenda, because you want to discuss those items while everybody is there, not when half the people have already left. And this is particularly important if the rules of the association specify, and some associations have this rule, that when you no longer have a quorum, the meeting must end. Right? There are some associations where you have a quorum when you start, and even if people start to leave, you can continue the meeting. But there are other associations whose rules specify that in the absence of a quorum, you cannot continue the meeting. The other thing I want to point out is that there are some agendas which retain matters that have been dealt with long ago. They're over and done with, but no one has bothered to take them out of the agenda. So those agenda items keep cropping up again and again. It's a waste of everybody's time, right? So and really it's up to the secretary. So when you know that a particular agenda item has been dealt with once and for all, it's not an ongoing thing, just take it up. Okay. So now we come to the actual conduct of the meeting, and there are some issues that need to be addressed. One of them is how formal should the meeting be? Now, this is actually a more difficult topic than it sounds, because a lot of people are unaccustomed to being formal. So they don't quite understand what that means. If you have a meeting that is a small group meeting, most of the people know each other well, they are close associates, and they are there to discuss one topic, it can be done very casually. It's perfectly all right. You can actually make better progress by dispensing with some of the formalities. But in most settings, you need to be a little formal and professional, because actually being that way makes the meeting run more smoothly. And one of the key aspects of being formal is to respect the chairperson, right? And always to address your remarks to the chairperson and to abide by the chairperson's rulings, unless, of course, you're convinced that the ruling is wrong. Those of you who have been in meetings with me may recall that I always refer to the chair as Mr. Chairman or as Madam Chairperson, no matter who that person is. Okay, the person may be your best friend, it may be someone very senior to you, it may be someone junior to you, right? But treat the chair with respect. Even if he's your best buddy, you don't refer to the chairperson as macha, right? All major decisions, all the important decisions, there are some routine decisions that can be taken more informally, but all major decisions must be made formally and recorded precisely, so that everyone is very clear what was decided and there can be no argument afterwards. And that is up to everybody. It's up to the chairman or the chairperson to repeat what the decision was. It's up to the secretary to make the proper record of it, and it's up to the participants to be very clear on what was decided. If you're unclear, raise your hand and say, "Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, but what exactly did we decide here? I have actually done this many times, right? When there was some lack of clarity about the decision that was taken and someone was in a hurry to move on to the next item. The record keeper should not be the chairperson. There are some small informal settings where the chairman is keeping his own records, but usually it's better for somebody else to do that, right? And the other thing I want to say is that people, everybody, chairperson, the people at the meeting, should make every effort to finish the business of the meeting within the allotted time. If the meeting is scheduled for 1 hour, make sure you end at 1 hour, because at the end of that hour, there may be something else that somebody else has to do. That person has to go. Now, it should be obvious from all this that the chairperson is a very, very important aspect of this meeting, right? The job of the chairperson is to control the meeting, but not to take the decisions, right? Maybe it's different if you're in a big corporation, right? Where the managing director and you have to take the decisions. It may be different if you're in the army or the captain of a naval vessel. But in an academic setting, in a professional setting, the chairperson is not the one who takes decisions unilaterally. He or she controls the meeting. Now, the meeting should always be chaired by the designated chairperson, normally the general president, the dean of the faculty, if it's a faculty board, the vice chancellor, if it's the senate, whoever it is, or if that person is absent for unavoidable reasons, the designated deputy, if there is one, right? So the president-elect, if it's SLAAS, the deputy vice chancellor, if there is one in the university, someone like that. But if both those people are unavailable or there is no designated deputy, then the members should elect a pro tem chair, right? And the election of the pro tem chair is actually a resolution. Someone proposes a name, someone seconds a name, anybody else can propose another name or second another name, right? You're not confined to just one name. In other words, you don't have to accept the first person whose name is proposed. And then you have an election if more than one name is present, or otherwise the person is elected without objection, and that person then chairs the meeting. So the chairperson can guide the discussion. Within reason, must allow all members to express their views, particularly when the viewpoints differ. Right? The chairperson is not there to say this is the way it has to be. And the chairperson has to ask each person's opinion, and this is particularly true when different people are having different opinions. Now, this is not to say that the chairperson is not allowed to have his or her own opinion. Obviously, that person is also present at the meeting, has an opinion, and should express that opinion strongly, but never to the point where you dominate the meeting or you suppress or disregard the contributions of others. Right? So the objective is that a democratic discussion is held and the final decision is arrived at in a democratic manner, with everybody allowed to contribute to it. At the same time, there's another thing a chairperson should be very careful about. You cannot allow the discussion of one topic to go on for an unreasonable length of time, or to allow the discussion to stray off the point. You always need to, because people do that. People do that all the time, that they start talking about other things. The chairperson must bring the discussion back to the point. Right? So you cannot allow one topic to dominate. You allow 2 hours for the meeting and you're spending 1.5 hours on one topic, you're not going to complete the agenda. Right? So if the chairperson has to decide exactly how much time can be reasonably allowed to devote to one topic, and then bring the discussion to a close in such a way that some kind of a decision is taken. Right now, there are 2 ways in which a discussion can be closed, particularly if there are more than one point of view being expressed. One is, as a result of the discussion, you arrive at a consensus. Everybody agrees, maybe there's a compromise. Some people change their minds about something, some people are willing to concede a point. Right? You arrive at a consensus, everybody agrees, and everything is fine. If you can't do that, you have to take a vote. Now, this is the one aspect of meetings in Sri Lanka where I have had a problem. I basically started my academic career in the United States. I spent the first 10 years of my academic career there, and I attended many meetings, and these meetings were conducted in a very formal way, right? Where there was a certain amount of time allowed, and at the end of whatever period of time the chairperson thought was reasonable for a particular topic, you ended the discussion. If there was no consensus, you took a vote, right? Everybody accepted the outcome of the vote. No one has hurt feelings. Nobody feels bad. Nobody takes it personally. In Sri Lanka, there seems to be a fear that people will take it personally, that there will be feelings hurt, people will get angry. The people who feel that way have no business to be taking part in meetings, right? So at the end of it, if that's the only way to take a decision, you take a decision by taking a vote, right? Because if you don't do that and the chairperson has to halt the discussion, no decision has been taken, and this matter just goes on endlessly. And I have been in situations where topics were discussed at meeting after meeting after meeting without some final decision being arrived at because a handful of people were objecting to it. That handful should not be permitted to have a veto, right? The view of the majority should prevail, right? So be prepared to take a vote. That's my biggest take-home lesson to all of you who are listening to me today. All members have a right to be heard once. And that again is up to the chairperson. There are meetings where somebody says something, somebody else has a counter argument. The first person counters the counter argument, and then a few minutes later, that person comes back and repeats the same thing all over again, right? And they just go on saying the same thing again and again, and no decision is arrived at. That cannot be allowed. So it's up to the chairman or chairperson to control that. Allow each person to speak once. Try, if possible, to get the junior members to speak early, to speak first, because junior members tend to be intimidated by the seniors, right? And sometimes their opinions can be suppressed or their minds change as a result of something that a senior person said. It's better to hear junior people speak first, right? Because otherwise you might not really hear them at all. It's a good idea to address the chair when you speak. In other words, don't talk to each other. Always talk to the chair, right? You should never interrupt another speaker except under very specific circumstances. And I will explain one of those exceptions, right? But in general, if a person has the floor, that means it's that person's turn to speak, the chairperson has given him the opportunity to speak, wait till he or she finishes speaking before you raise your hand and wait for the chair to recognize you. Now, the next topic I want to talk about, which is very important in meetings, is a conflict of interest. Very often you have in a meeting members who have a material interest in the matter being discussed, right? We call that a conflict of interest. Now, the material interest could be a financial interest, it could be a family interest, right? Or it could affect you personally. For example, you can imagine that you're on the editorial board of a particular organization, such as the National Science Foundation, and a paper comes before this editorial board. The editorial board has to make a decision whether to accept it or not. and one of the authors of that paper is your spouse or brother or a sister or something. Now that's a conflict of interest. You should declare it and say, I'm going to recuse myself, leave the room as long as that matter is being discussed, and you'll be invited back in as soon as the matter has been concluded. Now, not everybody does that, unfortunately. Okay? If you're known to have a conflict of interest, but you haven't declared it, the chairperson may ask you to leave. And that's very embarrassing when that happens. So it's better for you to leave voluntarily than wait for the chairperson to say, do you mind staying outside while we finish this discussion? Okay, because that's a part of professional integrity. Okay. So there are some rules for conducting formal meetings, and that will really be the next part of my talk. Where did these rules come from? I got my first taste of these rules, like I said, when I started my academic career in the United States, where it was made very clear at every meeting that rules would be followed, and those rules were to be found in this book called The Rules of Order by someone called Robert. Right? It's called Robert's Rules of Order. Now, Robert's Rules of Order is a book that's about 150 years old. It was written in the latter part of the 19th century. It's that old. It's based on the parliamentary procedures that developed, I suppose, in the United Kingdom and are also followed by the Congress in the United States. And as you know, parliaments have to be conducted in a very, very formal way. So occasionally we have parliamentarians who forget that. Now, Robert's Rules of Order can be downloaded from the internet if you are interested in acquiring a copy. I bought a copy 25 years ago, and I still refer to it. Okay, it contains very formal, detailed rules about motions or resolutions, about the order of precedence of motions, and about procedures. Procedural rules are all there. It's widely used in the United States, in academic settings, in local government, right, as well as in the state and federal government. Everybody refers to this. So it's useful to know what's in it. Maybe not so much in Sri Lanka, but certainly if you go abroad to the United States or the United Kingdom and you find yourself in a meeting there, it's good to know how the meeting might be conducted. Now, obviously, you don't have to follow Robert's rules. You can have your own rules. Any institution can have its rules of procedure. But if you don't, it's good to do what other people are doing, right? So if now the SLAAS, for example, does not have formal rules of procedure for conducting meetings. So it's good to know what the norm is, right? And to a great extent, the norm can be found in Robert's Rules of Order, which I do recommend to all of you. Now, you'll find in this book procedures and rules that go far beyond what we will ever use in Sri Lanka. Right? So you need to know what's applicable and what's not. And what I'm going to cover is basically what I think is applicable to our situation and not to worry about things that go beyond that. And so how formal are you going to be about making decisions? Now, routine matters can be dealt with very informally, and the bulk of the material that we deal with in a typical meeting of, say, the SLAAS Council or a faculty board, or certainly the Senate of a university, is absolutely routine. Right? A whole bunch of documents are submitted to you, you rubber stamp. Yes, 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 right? Because nobody knows any better. On the other hand, every so often, there are matters where the decision has to be taken a little bit more formally, or at least a little bit more explicit. Right? The decision is not implied, but actually formally taken. Right? And this is especially true where someone can express a second opinion, where someone can raise an objection. So in such a situation, it's useful for the chair to always ask if there are any objections. Right? If you are the chair of a meeting, it's good to ask. Even if it seems like a routine decision, just ask, are there any objections? Wait 3 seconds and then say something like, in the absence of objections, this is decided. Now, sometimes it's not that simple. Right? There are controversial matters where you actually have a debate at the meeting, where contrary opinions are expressed. There are people who want something, there are other people who object to it. You try to achieve a consensus. If you can't achieve the consensus, then you need to take a vote. And a vote requires a formal resolution. You vote on something. Right? The resolution or the motion, as we call them, will actually spell out what the decision is that is being taken. Right? So in complex situations, you need that. And in my humble opinion, that is the best way to deal with a lack of consensus, rather than just let the matter remain undecided and just drag on. And a lot of people get upset over that as well. So if you're dealing with a controversial issue, then the fact that it's controversial becomes apparent in the course of the discussion. And like I said earlier, any member who wishes to speak can be allowed to do so once. The chair should try to alternate between speakers on both sides, or if there's more than 2 sides, all sides of the issue. In other words, you don't want to have 6 people all saying the same thing and no one else has a chance to say a word. Okay. A speaker may be allowed a second chance only to respond to some point, that should be points, not pointed, points made by others. Okay. A person should not keep repeating his original statement, and in fact, the chair needs to put a stop to it if he does so. So you try to find a reasonable compromise. Right? If no compromise is possible, there's one other step that can be taken, right? If the matter does not have to be resolved immediately. In other words, at that meeting, you don't have to take an immediate decision. You can always try to postpone the discussion by 1 meeting. Postpone it till the next meeting, giving people time to think about it, right? Now, one of the actions that's often taken in this situation is to appoint a committee. Sometimes you have to do that, but in my experience, appointing a committee to deal with an issue is another way of not taking a decision, right? To sort of postpone the decision until everybody is forgotten about it. If the decision has to be taken, it's an important matter and the decision needs to be taken, it's better to take it rather than appoint a committee which will then take its own full time about conducting, half a dozen different meetings and not have something to bring back to the main body for 6 months. In fact, very early in my life, when I was attending meetings, a senior bureaucrat in a government department actually explained this to me. He was letting me on a bureaucratic secret. He says, if the big boss wants to take a decision which you think should not be taken, you encourage him to appoint a committee. And nothing will happen after that. So the bureaucrats know very well how to do this. Right? And sometimes, of course, you have to appoint a committee because no one understands the issue. But be careful how that is done. Okay. So when at the end of all this you need to take your final decision, right? The chair, having not allowed the decision to drag on for too long, and the chair does not allow the decision to be postponed indefinitely. So that means a few individuals who are very vocal can obstruct the whole body from taking a decision, right? So you avoid those 2 mistakes, and then you proceed to a vote. Right now, you have to have a formal resolution to vote on. This is called a motion. There has to be someone who proposes it and someone who seconds it. If it is not proposed and seconded, it is not valid unless it is proposed by the chair. In most situations, resolution proposed by the chair does not need to be seconded. Right? And assuming then that it has been sufficiently debated, you take a vote. And how you take the vote depends on the circumstances. So if it's an election, it's best done by secret ballot, of course. If it's some other kind of issue, it can be done by a show of hands or simply a voice vote, where everybody in favor says yes or yay, and the people opposed say nay, and usually you say it at the top of your voice, so it's pretty obvious if there's a majority. But if it's not clear that there's a majority one way or another, you at least count the show of hands. Okay. The minutes, we'll talk about minutes in a little bit. The minutes must record the exact wording of the resolution. And ideally, the person who proposed it and the person who seconded it, and then the outcome of the vote must also be recorded in the minutes. Now, it's a good idea to have a formal resolution for every major decision, whether it's controversial or not, whether it's opposed or not, something like an amendment to the rules, adoption of new policies, right? Many issues on which there is consensus, as well as questions on which there is no consensus, right? So it's good to have a resolution. It's something as simple as adopting the minutes of the previous meeting. Usually somebody proposes it and somebody seconds it, right? So that's a resolution. Now, the typical language of such a resolution is where someone gets up and says, I propose that, or I move that, and then reads out or voices the exact language slowly enough so that the secretary can record it, or maybe you have it on paper already. And then somebody else gets up and says, I second it. If there is no seconder, then of course, the motion is not valid. But once a motion has been proposed and seconded, it must be voted on, unless both the proposer and the seconder withdraw it. Both must withdraw it if it's not to be voted on, right? The chair cannot simply say, no, we can't take up this. We can't vote on it. If it has been proposed and seconded, there must be a vote, except in a situation called points of order. Okay, a point of order basically means that the motion violates the rules of the assembly. Now, the other day, I was listening to a debate in Parliament, and I actually heard the speaker use the phrase point of order. He said something like, make a point of order. Okay, so even our parliamentarians understand points of order, even though they may not understand how to run the country. Right? Now, the point of order is one of those rare situations where you can legitimately interrupt the proceeding, right? So if you're a member at a meeting and someone else is proposing a motion or seconding a motion which you believe violates the rules, right? And of course, there must be clear rules. Then you can interrupt the proceedings by getting up and saying, I rise to a point of order, or words to that effect. Can be point of order, Mr. Chairman, or something like that. Okay, but you let the chair know that there's a point of order, and then the chair must give you the floor. The chair must give the member who interrupted the floor, in other words, give him the opportunity to speak, and that person must then explain exactly why he is objecting to the motion. Right? And the objection must be based on the rules. The chair can then rule on the validity of the objection. It's up to the chair. The chair can say, you're wrong for the following reason. Or, yes, you're right. Your objection is valid. Right? So, if your objection is invalid, then the previous speaker can continue speaking. If the objection is held to be valid, the chairman upholds your objection, then the debate on the motion is supposed to stop. Okay. However, there's a caveat. Now, sometimes you might think the chairperson is biased and he's deciding against you unfairly. You're allowed to appeal the decision of the chair. Most institutions' rules allow an appeal from the decision of the chair, but that appeal is another motion, so it has to be seconded. In other words, when you turn around and say, I appeal the decision of the chair, somebody else must say, I second the appeal, right? Then it becomes a motion. And that motion must be voted on immediately because you're trying to overrule the chair. And some institutions will have a rule about that, saying to overrule the chair, you must have a 2/3 majority. If there's no such rule, of course, a simple majority can overrule the chair. Of course, you have to be very, very circumspect about overruling the chair. It's not something you would do casually, right? Because you allow, the purpose of having a chair is to be able to take those decisions about the validity of an objection. Okay, so assuming that no one has objected and raised a point of order, right? So we have a motion proposed and seconded, and now it's being debated. Such a motion is referred to as the main motion, or sometimes we use the term main question. Now, in the course of the debate, people can propose amendments. And I could say, for example, in that second sentence of your motion, I would like to make the following change. And I propose an amendment. That proposal is also a motion. It has to be seconded. Somebody else must get up and say, yes, I second it. Right? These are called subsidiary motions. So in a very complex situation, you will have the main motion, and then you will have one or more subsidiary motions. Now, the original proposer and seconder of the main motion may accept the subsidiary motion as a friendly amendment. Right? So if nobody else objects and the original proposer and seconder accept it as friendly, then we can consider the main motion to have been amended. Right? Otherwise, you have to take a vote on the subsidiary motion. You vote on the subsidiary motions first, right? And then, depending on how the vote went, the main question may be amended. And then only do you vote on the main question, whether amended or not. That is after the subsidiary motions have been dealt. So that is the formal way of dealing with the resolution. Okay. Now, not everybody wants to be that formal, so all kinds of shortcuts may occur. But in a situation where there is some controversy and people are objecting and people are shouting, right? This is the way to smoothly carry out the decision-making process without holding up the meeting too long. Now, speaking of holding up the meeting too long, there are some situations where the main question is being endlessly debated and people are hardly sick of it. Okay, so you want to bring the whole thing to a close, and there is a special kind of motion that allows you to do that. This is called calling the question. Calling the question is a motion that requires the debate to be stopped and the main question to be voted on immediately. In other words, you're getting ready to go home, this main question is still being talked about and no one is ready to put a stop to it. You want to insist that we take a vote immediately. You call the question. Now, calling the question is a motion. It has to be proposed, it has to be seconded. And it can't be proposed by interruption, right? You have to wait for whoever is speaking to finish. You raise your hand, and when the chair recognizes you, you say, Mr. Chairman, I call the question. Now, if you do this in Sri Lanka, most likely the chairman will look at you as though you were crazy because he will know what calling the question means. And the terminology is not commonly used in this country. So it's better to spell it out. Right? Spell out exactly what you mean. I propose that we take an immediate vote on the main question or on the resolution. And then somebody must second it. If that particular motion, calling the question, is proposed and seconded, you have to vote on it immediately. That cannot be debated. You cannot debate that particular motion. You vote on it immediately, right? And again, in some places, it requires a 2/3 majority, because you're halting a debate. You're basically telling your colleagues, we can't discuss this anymore, right? So in order to do that, sometimes you may require 2/3 majority. Of course, in most institutions, the rules are not spelled out. A simple majority may suffice. And if the motion passes, there's no further debate. You vote on the main question. Okay. So calling the question is a motion to vote on the main motion. 2 votes are taken. The first vote is the motion to vote, and the second one is the actual vote. Now, it's good to avoid all this, right? So people don't like to have votes. Other people's feelings might be hurt. So you try to arrive at a consensus. And actually, most of the time, that's what we do. Most of the time, not only here, but even in the United States, this is what we do. We arrive at a consensus. Now, the consensus can be implied. For simple, very routine, obvious decisions, we don't actually formally take a decision. If you look at the minutes of the meetings of the Council of the SLAAS, most decisions are taken by an implied consensus. The chairman doesn't even bother to ask, are there any objections? Understood that there aren't any. Right? But if thing is not that simple, it's a good idea for the chair to always ask, are there any objections? If there are no objections, the decision is taken without objection. That is consensus. Okay. Now, there's a little bit of formality here also. The decision taken without objection is said to be passed nem con. Now, the word nem, the phrase nem con is a Latin abbreviation of a Latin phrase called nemine contra dicente, which in Latin means with no one speaking against. In this country, we are not that formal. I mean, in my life, I have been at only one meeting where the chairman used the phrase nem con. And that particular individual was an Englishman who probably came from a culture where they talked in Latin. If you don't want to talk in Latin, that's all right. Right? Perfectly all right. You can simply say without objection. Decision is taken without objection and can be recorded that way. Now, one very important point I want to make is that a decision taken without objection is not the same as a unanimous decision. Right? That's a matter of great confusion. There are lots of people who say, yes, it was unanimous. Actually, it wasn't. Right? A unanimous decision means that everybody agreed to it actively. Everybody spoke in favor. In a small group, you can actually do that. Everybody can speak in favor, but in a large group, you don't give everybody a chance to speak. In that situation, you can only establish unanimity by taking a vote. Okay, now this is something that a lot of people forget. Everybody must raise their hand or do whatever to vote in favor. If everybody votes in favor, then it's a unanimous decision. Because there's a thing called abstention. Someone can say, I'm not going to vote. I'm abstaining. I'm not necessarily in favor. I'm not objecting. I'm keeping my mouth shut. Right? Now that is part of what we call no objection. But it is not unanimity. You get unanimity, that the word literally means of one mind. Right? So everybody has to be in favor of it and must express the fact that they are in favor of it. And one thing a chairperson should always refrain from doing is pressurizing the members to agree that a decision was unanimous. If the chairperson wants a decision to be unanimous, and sometimes it's very useful to do that, to put it to a vote and say, if you're in agreement, please raise your hand. If even one person doesn't raise his or her hand, then it's not unanimous. Okay? And the record of the meeting should not state that such a decision was unanimous. And I've had this experience where somebody is actually the late Professor J. Fernando, at a meeting of the Council of the Institute of Chemistry, kept insisting that a particular decision had been unanimous when it was very clear that it wasn't. Okay, let's talk about minutes. The meeting is not complete until the minutes are recorded and ultimately confirmed. So what should be in these minutes? Okay, a lot of extraneous things get into the minutes, and some things that should be there are sometimes not there. The minutes should include when and where the meeting was held, who chaired the meeting, who was present or excused. Right? We assume that people who are absent without being excused chose not to be there or could not be there, but didn't tell us ahead of time. Any preliminary actions, for example, a minute of silence in memory of a deceased person, sometimes you do that. And after that, the minute should be a record of the decisions taken according to the agenda. So you go point by point down the agenda, and for each point there's a decision taken. Right? Now, for some absolutely routine decisions, how the decision was taken can be left understood, right? What we call the implied consensus. Otherwise, it should be recorded. The decision was unanimous. The decision was taken without objection. The decision was taken by a vote, so many in favor, so many opposed, and so forth. Okay. If the decision was based on a resolution, then the names of the proposer and the seconder should be included if possible, if you remember. But the decision is more important than the proposer and the seconder. That's something I'll get to. But it's really important is to record the decision. The names of the proposer and the seconder are less important. The persons responsible for implementing the decision should be mentioned in the minutes, so that you know whom to give dirty looks to at the next meeting if nothing has been done. Now, it is not really important to include in the minutes, but everybody said while having the discussion. In fact, it's better not to do that. You can have a summary of the discussion, but only if it's really, really important. In most cases, you don't need that. The final decision is what is important. In fact, having a lengthy description of what this person said and what that person said can detract from the importance of the decision itself. The sorts of decisions that can be recorded, acceptance of the minutes of the previous meeting or amendments to the minutes of the previous meeting, the activities that that particular body is going to undertake or is undertaking. There may be administrative decisions that require approval, outcomes of elections, obviously. The approval or in some cases the rejection of any reports that have been tabled and follow-up action, if any. And by the way, I just draw your attention to that word table. Be careful when you use it because it has two different meanings depending on whether you're talking British English or American English. Okay? In British English, which I think most of us follow here, the word table at a meeting means to present for consideration at the meeting. To present for consideration at the meeting is called tabling. But in American English, the same word means postpone consideration of. So in America, when you table something, you're saying, we don't want to discuss it today. We'll discuss it some other day. You don't know when. Right? And American English have been making inroads into our use of the language. So let's be a little careful and clearly understand what you mean by the word table. And any motions that have come, formal motions, either accepted or rejected, those are decisions. And of course, any new business that may be brought. Okay. The minutes can also include any information given to the members in the course of the meeting, either verbally or in writing, which are not necessarily there for decision-making purposes, but to keep the members informed. Right? So it may be verbal. You can say the dean informed the faculty board that. By the way, note a common mistake in minutes. The verb inform always takes an object. It's what we call in English grammar, actually in grammar, a transitive verb. Transitive verb is one that takes an object. So the sentence is incomplete if there is no object. But very often I have seen the phrase, the dean informed or somebody informed, without saying who was informed. Right? That doesn't say the dean informed the faculty board. He says the dean informed that. Right? Now that sentence is incomplete. And I got tired of trying to correct those because they kept being repeated. Right? So if you want to not worry about having an object, you can use the word reported. The secretary reported that. Okay. Or it can be that some document was tabled. Again, be careful about the meaning of the word table. One other thing that the minutes can include, you don't normally record what somebody said, but sometimes a member, someone present at the meeting, may request that what he said be recorded. He wants to make a statement on the record, typically a dissent from a decision. And he wants to say, I did not agree to this decision. Right? And I want my dissent to be recorded. So he can request that, and that request should be honored. And then right at the end, in the minutes, there will be some statement to the effect that the meeting was concluded. Right? We sometimes use the word adjourn, so the word adjourn really means concluded for now, but will be conducted again later. Now, when you record a decision, what is important is that the decision actually taken should be recorded. Right? There must be complete clarity about what the decision is. That's why it's good if in a complex situation, you have a specific written motion. So then you don't have any doubt about what the decision was that was taken. Sometimes you run into a situation where a decision was taken, but it wasn't implemented. Or some other decision was later substituted for it by some other body. Right? Or somebody who comes for a meeting doesn't like a decision. Right? And what is very important is that the minutes should not be altered to justify it. The minutes should not be altered to suggest that some other decision was taken. I once attended, actually the very first meeting I attended of the academic board of the Institute of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at the University of Colombo. The minutes recorded a decision that had been taken at a previous meeting, at the previous meeting. And one of the people present, who happened to be the founder director of that institution, a very senior academic, but had not been present at the previous meeting, objected very strongly. Now, he didn't object to the decision, he objected to the fact that it was minuted. And he insisted that that minute be removed. And of course, because of his seniority, and he's a very senior gentleman, I won't mention the name, though I'm sure many of you know him. It was, I'm sad to say, left to me to explain to him that a decision taken at a meeting had to be minuted that way, and that if you didn't like the decision, you can change the decision, but you can't change the minutes. And he got quite annoyed and never came for a meeting after that. Right? But sometimes you have to be prepared to do that. I don't allow a decision that was not taken to be recorded in the minutes, no matter what. Now, sometimes you include the names of the proposer and the seconder, but that's not as important as the outcome. Right? So many routine decisions are taken without actually being proposed or seconded. Now, I want to show you an example of how not to record a minute. It's a very simple one. Okay, I've actually extracted this from a meeting held last January, that is 2 months ago, by one of the SLAAS sections, right? And the minutes recorded this. The minutes of the last meeting held on 13/1/2022, proposed as correct by Dr. I've removed the name, and seconded by Dr. Again, I have removed the name. What is wrong with this minute? Why is this minute incorrect? The minute does not record the decision that was taken. We don't know what decision was taken, right? We know that somebody proposed something and somebody seconded something, and that was it. So we can guess that the decision that was taken was in fact that the minutes were accepted as correct, but it doesn't say so. So there are several ways in which the minute could have actually been correctly recorded. One of them is to say, on the proposal of Dr. X, seconded by Dr. Y, the minutes of the last meeting held on such and such a date were approved. That is the important part. The minutes of the last meeting were approved. That is the decision that was taken. It is the names of the proposer and the seconder are not important, and in this case, they can even be omitted. And you could reasonably say the minutes of the previous meeting were adopted without objection or subject to the following amendments, depending on the situation, right? Even if you forget to mention who proposed and who seconded. For something as simple as the adoption of minutes, it's not critical, right? To mention who proposed and who seconded. But you must say the minutes were approved, right? Or adopted or amended, as the case may be. A word about professionalism. I talked about the importance of being professional right at the beginning of this talk, so let me get back to that. Okay, when you're recording minutes, if you want to, and I really am talking to the secretary, the secretaries, please check your grammar, use grammatical English, use complete sentences, don't use phrases and half sentences and bullets, right? Wherever possible, record the minute in complete English. Make sure you check your spelling, and particularly the correct spellings of people's names, right? My name, I spell it in a particular way. That's not the way how most people spell Guneratne. And so I find my name is misspelled very often. So I don't really mind. I mean, I'm not sensitive about these things, but some people are. The other thing is, when you refer to a particular individual in a professional setting, in an academic setting, use his or her title, which we do, followed by his or her last name, which much of the time we don't. Okay? So I expect, for example, to be referred to as Dr. Guneratne, not as Dr. Ranil, not as Dr. RD. In casual conversation, you can call me that. When you're my students, call me Dr. Ranil, Dr. RD. Some colleagues call me that. Right? It's sweet. I mean, it's very nice. It gives you a feeling of intimacy with those people. They know you so well, they can use your first name, but not in the minutes of a meeting. Okay, professionalism means you use that person's last name. Make sure you use correct English. In particular, use the correct word, not a word that sounds very similar. Now, there are many pairs of words in the English language that are pronounced in the same way, but have different meanings, are spelled differently and have different meanings. You don't know which one you're using. I picked just one example, and this is a very common mistake, and those two words are not even pronounced the same way. One is pronounced career, and the other is pronounced carrier. Now, a career is a person's job or livelihood or vocation. It's spelled C-A, R-E-E-R. A carrier is a person or a vehicle that carries something, right? When the Russians invaded Ukraine, their troops came in armored personnel carriers, right? But in our context, we usually mean courier. The day I first presented this talk, today is not the first time, it was at a workshop some time ago, and I put this slide together the previous evening without really paying too much attention. I was thoroughly embarrassed the next day when not one but two of the very senior academics who were giving talks before me at that workshop made this mistake and used carrier when they meant courier. Okay, so obviously that level of professionalism should extend to all documents submitted at the meeting, not just the minutes.